Have you ever wondered who would actually win in a fight, a samurai or a Viking? It's one of those debates that never seems to die. Ask 10 people and you'll probably get 10 different answers. Some will say the samurai without even thinking. Others will swear the Vikings would crush them. And honestly, but then I started digging into the history. And the deeper I went, the more I realized something surprising. This isn't really a fight between a katana and an axe. It's a fight between two completely different warrior cultures, two completely different ways of training. The samurai and the Vikings never actually met. The Vikings were active between the late 8th and 11th centuries, raiding across Europe and even reaching North America. The samurai, meanwhile, were just beginning to emerge in Japan before becoming the country's dominant warrior class centuries later. So geographically, these two worlds never collided. But that's exactly what makes this comparison so interesting, because history gives us enough clues to imagine what probably would have happened if they had. Let's start with something most people immediately point to: training. This is where the samurai usually get all the credit. A samurai wasn't someone who suddenly decided to become a warrior one day. If you were born into a samurai family, your training started incredibly early. As a child, you learned how to ride horses, shoot a bow, fight with a spear, and eventually master the sword. You were also taught discipline, patience, and strategy. Every lesson had one purpose: to prepare you for war. For a samurai, becoming a warrior wasn't a profession, it was life itself. Now compare that with the Vikings. Most Vikings weren't professional soldiers. They were farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, traders. Raiding wasn't necessarily something they did every day. For many, it was seasonal. They farmed when they needed to. Then, when the opportunity came, they picked up their weapons and sailed across the sea. Because while the samurai spent years preparing for battle, the Vikings spent years actually fighting them. England, Ireland, France, the Frankish Empire, even parts of Eastern Europe. Every campaign meant facing a different enemy with different weapons and different tactics. They had to adapt constantly. They learned through experience, often the hard way. The samurai had extraordinary discipline. The Vikings had extraordinary battlefield experience. So who wins this category? I'd still give a slight edge to the samurai. Years of structured training matter. Technique matters. Discipline matters. But the difference isn't nearly as big as people often assume. And once we move past training, things start getting much more interesting. Because there's one weapon everyone talks about: the katana. If you ask someone to picture a samurai, that's probably the first thing that comes to mind. It's elegant, beautifully crafted, and surrounded by almost mythical status. Some people even claim it was the greatest sword ever made. But here's something that surprised me. The katana wasn't even the samurai's primary battlefield weapon. That sounds strange, doesn't it? On large battlefields, samurai often relied on bows first, then spears. The sword usually came into play only after the fighting became much closer. The famous katana wasn't designed to solve every problem. It was one tool among many. The Vikings thought in a very similar way. They didn't rely on just one weapon either. Some carried swords. Many carried axes. Almost everyone carried a spear. And while those weapons get most of the attention, there was one piece of equipment that quietly made the biggest difference: the shield. It doesn't sound exciting. No one makes movies about shields. But if you ask military historians what kept warriors alive for thousands of years, shields almost always come up near the top of the list. A shield lets you absorb attacks instead of avoiding every one. It lets you push an opponent off balance. It creates openings. It protects you while you close the distance. And suddenly, something interesting happens. That legendary katana has a much harder time finding a clean target. The question isn't whether the katana was a greatsword. The real question is whether it could overcome a skilled opponent who knew exactly how to fight behind a shield. And that's where this debate starts to shift in a direction most people don't expect: armor. Because a great weapon only matters if it can actually get through what your opponent is wearing. Hollywood usually gets this completely wrong. Vikings are often shown charging into battle, wearing nothing but animal skins and leather. If a Viking could afford it, he'd wear chainmail, he'd wear a helmet, and he'd almost always carry a large, round shield. Chainmail was expensive, so not everyone owned it, but experienced warriors knew just how valuable it was. It was flexible, surprisingly durable, and especially good at protecting against slashing attacks. And no, they didn't wear horned helmets. That's one of the biggest myths in history. The samurai looked completely different. They wore armor made from hundreds of small lacquered plates, tied together with silk cords. It was designed to protect while still allowing enough movement to ride a horse, draw a bow, or swing a weapon freely. So whose armor was actually better? The honest answer is neither, because they were solving different problems. Japanese warfare evolved differently from warfare in Scandinavia. The weapons were different, the terrain was different, even the battles themselves looked different. Comparing the two is a bit like asking whether a Formula One car is better than a rally car. Each one was built for a completely different environment. And that brings us to something even more important than weapons or armor: how they actually fought. This is where most people imagine a perfectly fair duel. One samurai, one Viking, both standing in an open field. But history rarely works like that. The samurai were masters of precision. They trained endlessly to stay calm under pressure, waiting for exactly the right moment to strike. Every movement had a purpose. Every attack was measured. Wasting energy wasn't just inefficient, it could get you killed. The Vikings approached combat from a different angle. They believed in pressure, momentum, aggression. A Viking didn't necessarily need the perfect strike. He needed to force you into making one mistake. And once that mistake happened, he took advantage of it immediately. This is also where the Viking shield becomes incredibly important. Imagine trying to fight someone who is constantly advancing behind a wall of wood, using it to block, shove, and create openings. You're not just fighting the person anymore, you're fighting the shield too. Suddenly, the duel looks very different from what we see in movies. But weapons and armor only tell part of the story, because the person holding them matters just as much. So now imagine these two standing face to face. Neither wants to run. Neither expects mercy. Neither plans on surrendering. That's what makes this matchup so fascinating. The samurai notices his opponent first. He keeps his distance. He's patient, watching every movement, looking for the smallest opening. The Viking does the opposite. Shield forward, step by step, closing the gap. He's trying to force the samurai into reacting. If the samurai can control the distance, the advantage probably stays with him. His training, timing, and precision become incredibly difficult to overcome. But if the Viking gets close enough to turn the fight into a brutal exchange of strength and endurance, everything changes. The shield starts creating opportunities. The axe becomes more dangerous. The fight becomes chaotic. And chaos is exactly where experienced Vikings often thrive. So, who actually wins? If we're talking about a formal duel between two highly skilled warriors, I'd give a slight edge to the samurai. Years of disciplined training and exceptional technique are difficult to ignore. But if we're talking about the kind of messy, unpredictable battles that actually happen throughout history, I wouldn't be so confident. The Vikings' shield, adaptability, and experience fighting in brutal conditions make him an incredibly dangerous opponent. History rarely gives us clean answers. And honestly, that's what makes it so interesting. The samurai and the Viking weren't just great fighters. They represented two completely different civilizations. One became the symbol of discipline. The other became the symbol of fearless exploration. One shaped the history of Japan. The other reshaped much of medieval Europe. Centuries later, both are still remembered as some of history's greatest warriors. And maybe that's the real answer. The reason this debate has lasted so long isn't because one was clearly better than the other. It's because both were extraordinary in completely different ways. But now, it's your turn. Who do you think walks away from this fight? The samurai or the Viking? Let me know what you think, and more importantly, tell me why.